Mountains, man, they hold secrets, I always used to say. Some too big to know, some too dark to tell. 3 years ago, I joined the mountain rescue team. Not to chase mysteries, mind you. I just wanted to help, to be part of something bigger than myself. Little did I know, this job would make me question everything I thought I knew. It all started with a call that came in at twilight, just as the last bit of sun was dipping behind those jagged peaks. Our radio crackled, and the quiet of our little rescue station was shattered. Emergency beacon activation, coordinates received. The dispatcher's voice said, all professional, but I could hear the worry in it. Solo hiker. Beacon triggered once, then went silent. Last known location near Ridge 34B. Ridge 34B. Locals called it the Shattered Spin, and for a damn good reason. Sharp, uneven rocks jutted out like broken bones. Not a place you'd want to be caught in, especially not alone, and definitely not as night started creeping in. Gear up. Maru, our team leader, set his face a mask of calm determination. He was already pulling on his jacket. We're moving out in 10. John grunted as he laced up his boots. Solo hiker, again. They never listen, do they? No, they don't. Vedum murmured, packing medical supplies in her backpack. She was always quiet, always prepared. Me? I was stuffing my own gear into a bag, hands shaking a little. I wasn't new to this, but something about the silence outside felt heavy, like the mountains were holding their breath, waiting. By the time we headed out, darkness was already starting to swallow the slopes. Our headlights cut thin beams through the gathering mist, lighting up patches of frost-covered ground and trees that looked like skeletons. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that stings your lungs with each breath. Maru led the way, compass in hand, his steps sure and steady. John followed, his big frame moving with the easy grace of someone who's spent years on these trails. Vedum walked beside me, quiet as always, her eyes scanning the shadows. We followed the coordinates to the base of Ridge 34B, and that's where we found the first sign of the hiker, a discarded glove, half buried in the snow. The fabric was torn, the edges frayed, like it had snagged on something sharp, and nearby, faint tracks led uphill, disappearing into the mist. This way, Maru said, his voice steady as ever. We started climbing. The terrain got rougher with every step. Loose rocks slid under our boots, and the wind picked up, howling through the crags like some kind of animal. Every now and then, I thought I heard something else beneath the wind, a faint, almost coughing sound. But whenever I stopped to listen, it was gone. Keep moving, John said, his tone gruff. We're wasting daylight, Dot. Not much daylight left to waste, I muttered under my breath. The tracks led us to a small plateau where the wind, strangely, seemed to just stop. It left this eerie stillness in its wake. A scrap of fabric, matching the glove, dangled from a jagged rock, fluttering weakly. This is where he passed through, Vedum said, crouching down to examine the snow. But the tracks, they're strange. What do you mean? I asked. She hesitated, her brow furrowing. The look hurried, like he was running. But from what? Maru straightened up, scanning the ridge above. Let's set up a temporary base here, he said. We'll regroup and figure out our next move. We pitched the small camp quickly. We were used to this, but the unease lingered. As we sat around the dim glow of a portable lamp, the silence pressed against us like something solid. Even John, who was usually the first to crack a joke, seemed subdued. Maru unfolded a map, tracing the route with his finger. If these tracks are fresh, he can't be far. We'll push higher at first light. And if the weather turns, Vedum asked. Then we adapt, he replied. We always adapt. The wind picked up again as we huddled in our sleeping bags. its mournful howl finding cracks in the rocks and echoing like distant cries. I lay there, staring at the stars through a gap in the clouds, trying to convince myself that the strange sounds were just my imagination. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. Something patient. Something that knew we were there. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures moving through the mist, their faces hidden, their voices just whispers that sent chills down my spine. I woke with a start just before dawn, the cold seeping into my bones. As I sat up rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I saw Maru already awake, standing at the edge of the plateau. He was staring up at the ridge, his silhouette dark against the faint glow of the early light. "Anything?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He didn't look back. "No, but we need to move soon." The others stirred as the first rays of sunlight painted the peaks in muted gold. We packed quickly, the tension from the night before still hanging heavy in the air. We were all feeling it. As we climbed higher, the tracks became even more erratic, zigzagging and doubling back. It was like the hiker had been lost, confused, or trying to shake something off his trail. "Doesn't make sense," John muttered. "Why would he?" A sudden cry cut him off. Faint, but distinct. It echoed across the rocks, bouncing off the ridges until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. Maru nodded. "That way," he said, pointing towards a narrow gorge that sliced through the ridge. We moved quickly, the cry repeating once more before fading into silence. The gorge was steep and shadowed, the walls pressing in close. The air felt heavier here, each breath an effort. Halfway through, Vedum stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. "Wait, what is it?" Maru asked. She pointed to the ground. A faint smear of blood stained the snow, leading towards a small alcove hidden in the rock face. We approached cautiously, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Inside the alcove, we found what could only be described as a makeshift shelter, a tattered sleeping bag, a few scattered supplies, and a flashlight with a dim, flickering beam. "He was here," Vedum said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But where is he now?" John asked, his eyes scanning the shadows. None of us had an answer. As we stood there, the wind howled through the gorge again, carrying with it a sound that sent a shiver down my spine, a low, mournful wail like something not entirely human. Maru tightened his grip on his walking stick. "Let's move," he said. "Whatever's out here, we need to find him before it does." The wind carried the sound away, leaving us in an uneasy silence. No one spoke, each of us straining to hear something, anything. That might explain that low, guttural wail. It had been distinct, not like an animal, and not like shifting ice. It lingered in my mind, filling the quiet with its eerie resonance. "We're not alone out here," John muttered, breaking the silence. His voice was gruff, but I caught the unease in his tone. Maru tightened his grip on his trekking pole, his expression unreadable. "Stay focused." "It could have been the wind," John said, though it was clear he didn't believe it. Vedum glanced back toward the makeshift shelter, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she was thinking the same thing as the rest of us. Whoever made that noise wasn't okay, and if it was the hiker, he wasn't in any shape to be calling out for help. We pressed on, moving deeper into the gorge. The snow became patchier, revealing bare stone beneath, slick with ice. The walls closed in, narrowing to a steep, uneven trail. Every step felt like a balancing act, and the silence only made the crunch of our boots against rock and snow more oppressive. I spotted another clue before anyone else, a single glove lying just ahead, half covered in frost. Its black fabric was faded and torn, the fingers stiff from the cold. I knelt to pick it up, holding it up for the others to see. "Another sign," I said. "But why is he leaving these behind?" John frowned. "Maybe he didn't mean to. Could have fallen off. Or he's hurt," Vadum said quietly, her eyes scanning the trail ahead. "He's bleeding, remember." The reminder of the bloodstains from earlier made my stomach tighten. I thought of the smear we'd seen, the way it disappeared into the gorge, as if the mountain itself had swallowed it. Maru nodded toward the trail. "We keep moving. If he's injured, he won't get far." The tension grew heavier as we climbed. Shadows stretched long and dark across the walls, the sunlight above barely touching the bottom of the gorge. It was colder here, the air thin and biting. I struggled to keep my breathing steady, each inhale stinging my lungs. We came across another sign a short while later, a patch of trampled snow, disturbed as if someone had struggled there. A faint streak of red cut through it, trailing toward a nearby outcrop. Vedum crouched down, brushing her fingers lightly over the ground. "This isn't from an animal," she said. "The tracks are too erratic. It's like he was dragged." Dragged? By what?" John snapped. "He was alone, right? No one else was supposed to be out here." "That we know of," Vedum replied, her voice barely audible. Before John could argue, a faint sound stopped us in our tracks. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, a low, rhythmic noise that reminded me of coughing. It came from further up the trail, just beyond a sharp bend in the gorge. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Maru held up a hand, signaling for silence. We stood there, frozen, listening as the sound grew louder. It wasn't coughing, not exactly. It was more like the ragged gasps of someone struggling to breathe, each exhale punctuated by a faint rasp. "Karen," Maru called out, his voice echoing off the walls. "It's the rescue team. Can you hear us?" The gasping stopped abruptly, leaving only the hollow whistle of the wind in its wake. My pulse quickened, the silence amplifying every noise, the shift of snow beneath my boots, the faint rustle of fabric as I adjusted my gear. "Let's go," Maru said, his voice steady but low. "Stay close." The trail twisted sharply, leading us to a narrow ledge that hugged the side of the gorge. Below, a steep drop disappeared into darkness, the bottom obscured by mist. We moved single file, each step careful and deliberate. My palms were sweaty despite the cold, and I kept my eyes on the person in front of me, afraid to look down. "Fresh footprints," Vedum said, pointing to the snow ahead. They were deep, erratic, as if the person making them had been stumbling. We followed them until the ledge widened, leading to a small clearing partially sheltered by overhanging rock. There, nestled against the wall, was a crude lean-to made of branches and torn fabric. The initials, QL, were carved into one of the supports, a detail that made my stomach sink. This had to be his. "This is his," Vedum said, crouching to inspect the shelter. "He was here recently." Maru and John began searching the area, their movements brisk but careful. I stayed near Vedum, my eyes scanning the shadows. Something about the clearing felt wrong. The air was heavier here, carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded me of blood. Vedum reached into the lean-to and pulled out a bandage. Its edges were crusted with dried blood. She held it up, her brow furrowing. "He's losing a lot of blood. If we don't find him soon." A sudden scream tore through the air, cutting her off. It was high, pitched and guttural, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around, searching for the source. What the hell was that? John hissed, his hand gripping the handle of his ice axe. "Stay together," Maru barked. Don't move unless I say so." The scream came again, this time fainter, as if it were being carried away by the wind. My chest tightened, every muscle in my body tense. It didn't sound human. Or if it was someone in unimaginable pain. "Is it him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Maru said. "But we're not splitting up. Vedam, mark this location. We'll keep following the tracks." The footprints led us higher, winding through a narrow corridor of jagged rocks. The walls were streaked with ice, reflecting the dim light in strange, fragmented patterns. Every sound, every crunch of snow, every shift of rock seemed louder here, the echoes stretching unnaturally long. Then, the tracks stopped. We stood at the edge of a steep incline, the snow untouched beyond it. It was as if the hiker had vanished into thin air. "He didn't just disappear," John growled. "There has to be something." A faint sound interrupted him, drawing all our attention. It was coming from below, deeper in the gorge, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like stones knocking against each other. It was steady, deliberate, and too regular to be natural. "What is that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Maru didn't answer. He stared down into the darkness, his jaw clenched. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. "We'll find out," he said finally. "But not tonight. We're setting up camp." No one argued. The tapping continued as we descended to a flat area sheltered from the wind, its rhythm haunting us with every step. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every gust of wind, every creak of the rocks felt like a warning. I stared up at the dark sky, my mind replaying the scream, the footprints, the strange tapping. Sleep didn't come easily. The night dragged on in restless silence. I barely slept, the occasional clinking sound from the gorge below prickling my nerves. It was as if the tapping stones were calling out in some kind of rhythm I couldn't decipher, an erratic pulse echoing through the rock walls. My thoughts spiraled, my mind conjuring images of what might be waiting for us out there. By the time the first pale light crept over the ridge, I was already awake, sitting by the remnants of our small fire. The others stirred one by one. John stretched, his movements sluggish. Vedam rubbed her eyes and checked her medical supplies, though her usual calm demeanor seemed forced. Only Maru appeared focused, already packing his gear and scanning the horizon. "Today, we find him," Maru said firmly as we gathered. "And we end this search." The certainty in his voice didn't match the unease on his face. I nodded, though my chest tightened at the thought of what we might find. We broke camp quickly, the air heavy with anticipation. The faint trail of footprints we'd followed yesterday was gone, erased by the night wind. Maru directed us toward the gorge, where the clinking sound had grown fainter, but still lingered in the background. The descent into the gorge was steep and treacherous. Ice covered the rocks, forcing us to move slowly, testing each step. The tapping grew louder as we neared the bottom, each knock distinct yet inexplicable. When we reached the floor, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving us in an oppressive silence, broken only by our own breathing. "What the hell was making that noise?" John asked, his voice bouncing off the jagged walls. "Doesn't matter now," Maru said, eyes open. We moved forward. We followed the gorge's path as it narrowed into a cramped corridor. The air grew colder, the sunlight above barely reaching us. I spotted something ahead and called out, "There's something here." We approached cautiously. It was another makeshift shelter, smaller and less stable than the one we'd found yesterday. A tattered blanket was draped over a pile of rocks, forming a crude tent. A flashlight lay nearby, its beam flickering weakly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Vedum crouched beside the shelter and examined its contents. "He was here," she murmured, holding up a small notebook. The edges were frayed, and the pages inside were warped from moisture. She flipped through it carefully, scanning the shaky handwriting. "What does it say?" I asked. Vedum hesitated, her brow furrowing. "It's rambling. He writes about hearing things, seeing things that aren't there. He mentions shadows moving in the corners of his vision, voices calling his name. Hallucinations." Maru asked, his tone skeptical. "Possibly, but he sounds terrified," Vedum replied. She handed the notebook to Maru, who skimmed it briefly before tucking it into his jacket. John kicked at the rocks near the shelter, his frustration evident. "This doesn't help us find him. He's either losing his mind or he's already dead." "We don't know that," Maru said sharply. "And until we do, we keep searching." The tension between them was palpable, but there was no time to dwell on it. As we moved further into the gorge, the tapping returned, faint but steady. Each sound seemed to press against my chest, my breaths growing shorter. We came to a sudden stop when the trail opened into a small clearing. In the center was a shallow pit ringed with blackened stones, as if someone had attempted to build a fire but never lit it. Around the edges were scattered belongings, a torn jacket, an empty water bottle, and what looked like scraps of a map. "He was here," I said, my voice barely audible. Vedum bent down to pick up the scraps of the map. Her fingers brushed against something in the snow, and she froze. "Wait," she whispered. "What head is it?" Maru asked, stepping closer. She pointed to the ground. Embedded in the snow was a series of symbols, crudely drawn and overlapping. They were circles and lines, some jagged, others smooth, forming patterns that didn't make any sense. The snow around them had hardened, as if the symbols had been etched with something hot or sharp. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know," Vedum said, her tone unsteady. "But Karen mentioned symbols in his notebook. He wrote that they were always there, but didn't explain what they meant." John took a step back, shaking his head. "This is nuts. We're chasing a lunatic into God knows where, and now we're finding this. What if he's not running from something? What if he's the danger?" "Enough," Maru said firmly. "This doesn't change the mission. We find him and bring him back. Let's move." The unease was thick as we continued. The gorge walls closed in again, the space feeling suffocating. The symbols lingered in my mind, their nonsensical shapes burning into my thoughts. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the trail ahead, but the air seemed heavier with each step. Then we heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like breathing. It came from somewhere ahead, echoing faintly. Maru signaled for us to stop and motioned for silence. The sound grew louder, irregular and wheezing, like someone struggling to draw breath. "Karen!" Maru called out cautiously. The sound stopped abruptly. We waited, the silence stretching on until it became unbearable. Maru gestured for us to follow as he moved toward the source of the noise. My heart pounded in my chest, every nerve on edge. The gorge opened into another clearing, this one larger and littered with debris. Broken branches, shredded fabric, and torn pieces of paper were scattered across the ground. In the center was a figure, hunched over and trembling. It was Karen. He was unrecognizable from the man in the photo we'd been given. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. His clothes were in tatters, and his hands were raw and bloody. He clutched a sharpened stick, holding it out in front of him like a weapon. "Stay back," he screamed, his voice hoarse and panicked. "Don't come any closer. Karen, we're here to help," Maru said, keeping his voice calm. He took a cautious step forward, his hands raised. "You activated your beacon." We're here to bring you home. You're lying, Karen shouted, his voice cracked, and tears streamed down his face. You're not here to help. You're here to take me. No one's taking you, Maru said. We just want to help. You're injured. Let us take you back. Karen's grip on the stick tightened, and he backed away. You don't understand. They're watching. They're always watching. Who's watching? I asked, my voice trembling. His eyes darted around the clearing, scanning the shadows. You don't see them? They're right there. Right there. There was nothing there. Just shadows and snow. Before we could react, Karen lunged forward, his stick aimed at Maru. John intercepted him, grabbing his arms and wrestling the stick away. Karen thrashed and screamed, his words incoherent. Hold him down, Maru ordered. It took all of us to restrain him. His strength was wild and desperate, fueled by sheer terror. When he finally collapsed, exhausted and sobbing, we let go, keeping a cautious distance. Vedam knelt beside him, her voice soft and soothing. Karen, you're safe now. We're here. No one's going to hurt you. He looked up at her, his eyes hollow. You don't understand. It's not safe. It's never safe. What's not safe? I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he curled into himself, trembling. The weight of his words hung over us like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. As night fell, we prepared to make camp in the clearing. None of us spoke, the events of the day leaving us shaken. The shadows around us seemed deeper, the cold more biting. And in the distance, the faint tapping resumed its rhythm, echoing in the dark. The night was restless, weighed down by Karen's muttered warnings and the unrelenting tap, tap, tap that echoed through the gorge. We took turns keeping watch, though none of us could truly relax. Every rustle of the wind, every crack of settling snow felt amplified in the stillness. I found myself staring at the faint glow of the portable lamp, the rhythmic tapping gnawing at my nerves. Karen sat apart from us, his back pressed against the rock wall. He rocked slightly, muttering under his breath, his eyes darting to the shadows. Vedam stayed closest to him, her voice gentle but firm as she tried to coax him into clarity. The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether we were protecting him or ourselves. When morning finally arrived, it brought little comfort. The sunlight barely penetrated the walls of the gorge, and the cold was sharper than ever. Maru took charge, his tone brisk as he outlined our plan. We're moving as soon as we're ready, he said. Karen stays in the middle of the group. John, you take point. Vedam, keep an eye on him. No one wanders off. We stay together, no exceptions. What about the tapping? I asked, my voice barely steady. It was coming from deeper in the gorge. Should we check it out? Maru's jaw tightened. No. Our priority is getting Karen out of here safely. The rest doesn't matter. John muttered something under his breath, but he didn't argue. None of us wanted to linger longer than necessary. We began our ascent, retracing our path toward the upper trails. The footprints from the day before had vanished, swallowed by fresh snow, but Maru guided us with steady precision. Karen moved haltingly, his weight leaning heavily on Vedam's shoulder. His muttering had ceased, replaced by a haunted silence. The tapping, however, had not stopped. It followed us, faint and intermittent, as if it were moving parallel to our path. Every time it grew louder, I found myself glancing at the others, searching their faces for reassurance. John's expression was tense, his shoulders hunched as if expecting something to spring from the shadows. Vedam focused on Karen, her jaw set, while Maru's face betrayed nothing. By midday, we reached a narrow ledge that offered a view of the gorge below. The air was thinner here, and the climb had left us winded. Maru called for a break, his eyes scanning the horizon. We're making good time, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. John stood at the edge of the ledge, his gaze fixed on the distant ridges. I don't like this, he muttered. That noise, it's not natural, and Karen's not making any sense. He's traumatized, Vedam said sharply. He's been out here for days, injured and alone. Wouldn't you be a mess? John turned to her, his expression hard. Sure, but that doesn't explain the tapping, or the symbols, or why he's acting like we're the ones chasing him. Enough, Maru interjected, his tone sharp. We don't have time for this. Stay focused. The tension between them simmered as we resumed our climb. Karen stumbled frequently, his legs weak and unsteady. Each time, Vedam caught him, her patience unwavering. I admired her calm, though I could see the strain in her eyes. The tapping grew louder as we approached another bend in the trail. This time, it was accompanied by a faint, irregular scraping like metal against stone. My pulse quickened, and I saw John's hand tighten around his ice axe. Wait, Maru said, raising a hand to stop us. Stay here. He moved ahead cautiously, his steps deliberate. I held my breath as he disappeared around the bend, the scraping sound growing louder. Seconds felt like minutes as we waited, the silence between us oppressive. When Maru returned, his expression was grim. There's a backpack ahead, he said. It's torn open. Looks like Karen's. Karen's head snapped up at the mention of his name. No, he choked, his voice raw. Don't go near it. Don't touch it. We need to check it for supplies, Maru said evenly. It might tell us what happened. Karen shook his head violently, his eyes wide with panic. It's theirs now. You can't take it. They'll know. Who's they? I asked, my voice trembling. What are you talking about? But Karen didn't answer. He buried his face in his hands, rocking back and forth as he mumbled incoherently. Vedam placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression torn between concern and fear. Let's move, Maru said. We'll grab the pack and keep going. The backpack was exactly as Maru had described, torn open, its contents scattered across the snow. I recognized some of the items from our initial briefing: a small first aid kit, a water filter, a partially crushed energy bar. But there was something else, something that made my stomach drop. Symbols. The same ones we'd seen in the snow, etched into the fabric of the pack. They were crude but deliberate, their shapes jagged and overlapping. A faint, dark stain spread across the bottom of the pack, the edges crusted with ice. Blood? Vedam murmured, her face pale. Looks fresh, John said grimly. Whatever happened here, it wasn't long ago. Maru didn't respond. He crouched beside the pack, his gloved fingers brushing over the symbols. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched as he stared at them. This doesn't make sense, he said finally. Why would he do this? Maybe he didn't, I said quietly. Maybe someone else did. The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. None of us wanted to entertain the possibility, but the symbols were there, undeniable and unnerving. We keep moving, Maru said, his voice firm. No more stops until we reach the upper ridge. The climb grew steeper as the day wore on. The tapping followed us, sometimes distant, sometimes disturbingly close. Karen's condition deteriorated, his steps growing slower and more labored. Vedam did her best to support him, but it was clear he wouldn't last much longer without proper care. By the time we reached the ridge, the sun was beginning to set. The wind howled across the exposed terrain, biting through our layers. Maru directed us toward a cluster of rocks that offered some shelter from the elements. We camp here, he said. One last push tomorrow. The mood was somber as we set up camp. Karen lay curled in his sleeping bag, his breathing shallow. Vedam checked his vitals, her expression grim. He's dehydrated, she said. We need to get him off this mountain soon. Maru nodded, but his gaze was distant, his thoughts elsewhere. John sat apart from us, sharpening his ice axe with deliberate precision. I couldn't tell if he was trying to calm himself or prepare for something. As darkness fell, the tapping returned, louder and more persistent than ever. It seemed to echo from all around us, bouncing off the rocks in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint its source. We're not alone, John said quietly, his voice taut with tension. No, Maru replied. We're not. We sat in uneasy silence, the tapping filling the void. Karen stirred suddenly, his eyes wide with terror. They're here, he whispered. They found us. The words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to dismiss them, to chalk them up to his delirium, but the fear in his voice was palpable. And then, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed down on us, heavy and suffocating. Every muscle in my body was tense. Every instinct screaming that something was wrong. What now? I whispered. But no one answered. We sat there, frozen in place, waiting for whatever was coming. The first scream cut through the night like a knife. It wasn't Karen. It wasn't any of us. It was coming from the darkness, just beyond the edge of our camp. The scream froze us in place. It cut through the stillness like a serrated blade, raw and desperate, sending a primal jolt of fear through every nerve in my body. My eyes darted to the others, searching for some semblance of calm, but their faces mirrored my own terror. It's not him, John whispered, his voice taut with dread. That wasn't Karen, duh. No, it wasn't, Maru said. His voice was calm, but his knuckles whitened around the grip of his trekking pole. Stay close. Weapons ready. We're not running, but we're not waiting around either. Karen began to mutter, his words fast and slurred, like a broken record skipping over the same phrase. They here, they're here, they're here. He rocked back and forth, clutching his knees, his eyes unfocused and darting to the shadows. Karen, you need to stay with us, Vedam said firmly, gripping his shoulder. She shot Maru a worried glance. He's not in any state to move. Then we carry him, Maru said without hesitation. Whatever made that noise, we don't wait for it to find us. The climb back up the ridge was agonizing. Karen's condition deteriorated further, his weight slumping against John and Vedam as they supported him. He muttered under his breath the entire way, a mix of warnings and nonsensical phrases. They're in the snow. It's not real. It's not real. Don't look at the eyes. The tapping sound resumed as we ascended, more persistent and disjointed than before. It no longer seemed to follow us but surrounded us, echoing from every direction. It wasn't natural. Stones don't move like that. They don't tap in rhythm, then stop, then start again. What is it? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as we trudged forward. My breath fogged in the cold air, my chest tight with the effort of climbing and the weight of fear. No one stopped to find out, Maru said curtly. He had taken point, his silhouette a steady presence in the mist, eyes ahead. We're close to the plateau. Once we're clear of this gorge, we'll reassess. But I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Every few minutes, I thought I saw movement in the periphery of my vision, dark shapes darting between the rocks, just out of sight. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had to be. We reached the plateau as the last light of day began to fade. The wind picked up, howling across the exposed rock, carrying with it the faint, almost indistinguishable sound of whispers. No one spoke as we dropped our packs and huddled together, trying to regain our composure. Do we set up camp here? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. No, Maru said. We don't stop again until we're back at base camp. It's downhill from here. We can make it. What about him? John gestured to Karen, who was slumped against a rock, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow. We carry him, Maru said, his tone brooking no argument. We don't leave anyone behind. The descent was brutal. The trail was steep and uneven, and the shadows of the mountain seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally as the moonlight struggled through the mist. The tapping grew louder the further we went, now interspersed with faint clicking sounds. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of exhaustion and dread pressing down on us. Halfway down, Karen stirred. His eyes snapped open, wild and frantic, and he began to thrash, forcing John and Vedum to stop. "Let me go," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "They'll follow me if you take me. They'll follow you too." "Karen, calm down," Vedum said, her voice strained as she tried to restrain him. "We're here to help you. You're safe with us." "No one's safe," Karen shouted. His voice broke into a guttural sob, his body convulsing with terror. "You don't understand. They're in the snow and the wind. You can't take them with you." "Enough," Maru barked, stepping forward. He crouched in front of Karen, gripping his shoulders firmly. "Look at me. We're not leaving you. We're getting out of here. Do you hear me?" Karen froze, his breathing ragged, his eyes locked on Maru's. For a moment, it seemed like the fight had left him. But then he whispered, his voice barely audible, "Thee won't let me leave." We reached the lower slopes just as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight piercing the mist. The base camp was in sight, a small, reassuring structure at the edge of the tree line. Relief swept over me, though it was tempered by the oppressive silence that had settled around us. The tapping had stopped, but the absence of it felt just as wrong. As we approached the camp, Karen began to weep. He mumbled incoherently, his words lost in the wind, but his anguish was palpable. Vedum stayed close to him, her hand on his shoulder, while the rest of us kept a wary eye on the surroundings. We crossed the threshold of the camp, and for the first time in what felt like days, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The small shelter offered a semblance of safety, a barrier between us and the vast, uncaring mountain. But as we stepped inside, Karen's sobbing stopped abruptly. He went still, his body rigid, his eyes wide with terror. "What is it?" Vedum asked, her voice trembling. "They're here," Karen whispered. "Thee followed us." I turned to look out the window, my stomach twisting into knots. At first, I saw nothing, just the barren landscape, the snow stretching endlessly into the horizon. And then I saw them, dark figures standing motionless at the edge of the tree line. Their shapes were indistinct, their presence undeniable. "Shut the door," Maru said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. John slammed it shut, bolting it with trembling hands. We stood in silence, the air thick with fear, as the shadows outside remained still, watching. "Thee won't come in," Karen said, his voice hollow. "Thee never come in." The retrieval team arrived hours later. By then the figures were gone, leaving no trace of their presence. Karen was taken to the nearest medical facility, his condition critical but stable. He said nothing as they carried him away, his eyes fixed on the mountains. As we packed our gear, I found myself standing at the window, staring at the place where the shadows had been. I wanted to believe it had been a trick of the light, an illusion born of exhaustion and fear. But deep down, I knew better. The mountain kept its secrets, and some of them were too dark to be uncovered. As we left, I cast one last glance at the peaks. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement, a faint, fleeting shadow disappearing into the mist. But it was probably just my imagination. Wasn't it?